Hey everyone, tonight we're dimming the lights and stepping into a world where night ruled everything. Not just the sky, but the rhythm of life itself. No electricity, no glowing clocks, no TikTok scrolling at 2 a.m. Only the steady hush of darkness and the soft pulse of firelight. This is how medieval people slept. And, spoiler, it was stranger, quieter, and in some ways, wiser than the way we do now. Before we start, take a moment to like the video, only if you actually enjoy what I do here, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Because somewhere out there it's midnight, and someone's probably half asleep watching this, wondering if they should have gone to bed an hour ago. Well, so were they 700 years ago. Now, close your eyes for a second and imagine this: a small, smoky room, the faint smell of wood ash, a dog curled up by the fire, and a sky so black you could fall into it. Welcome to the medieval night. Before the glow of bulbs and the tyranny of alarm clocks, people slept in rhythm with the world. They followed what was known as segmented sleep, or the two-sleep pattern, a natural division of the night into two halves, first sleep and second sleep. And between them, an hour or two of wakefulness called the watch. This was not an accident or a malfunction of the human brain. It was routine, as normal as sunrise, as expected as prayer. When the sun went down, people didn't fight the dark. They accepted it. They ate supper, told stories by the hearth, prayed, and when the last glow of fire faded, they went to bed, early, usually just after sunset. That first sleep lasted about 4 hours, until somewhere past midnight when their bodies naturally stirred. Then came the watch. During the watch, the world existed in a different frequency. It wasn't quite night, not yet morning. The mind floated between dreams and wakefulness, soft and lucid. People used that quiet time to think, to whisper, to fix, to pray. They tended the hearth so it wouldn't die out. They might check on their animals, or depending on who you asked, on their neighbors. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of small, deliberate life, and yes, this was also the preferred hour for intimacy. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals swore by it. After the first sleep, the body was rested, the mind calm, and the couple, let's say, cooperative. It was their 3 a.m. version of quality time. So, if you've ever thought making your partner coffee in the morning was romantic, your ancestors were setting the bar at a very different hour, and without caffeine. After the watch came the second sleep, a deep, serene rest that lasted until dawn. This was when the body truly healed, when dreams turned vivid, and when the faint light of morning crept in like forgiveness. It was a rhythm everyone followed. Peasants, monks, nobles alike. Even Chaucer mentioned it in passing, as though everyone already knew what between first and second sleep meant. Modern science now whispers what medieval wisdom knew instinctively. When artificial light disappears, our circadian rhythm naturally divides itself in two. The brain releases melatonin twice per night, first after sunset and again after the watch. Our ancestors weren't broken. They were aligned. We are the strange ones, forcing our bodies to compress the night into one unbroken block, as though sleep were a race against the clock. The Industrial Revolution changed all that. Factories demanded uniform hours, gas lamps turned night into profit, and suddenly 8 hours of continuous sleep became the mark of efficiency, not health. We stopped listening to our biology and started obeying the bell. And the quiet, reflective middle of the night, that hour when people used to sit by the fire and whisper prayers or secrets, vanished. So if you wake at 2 a.m. and can't fall back asleep, don't panic. You're not anxious. You're just accidentally medieval. Whisper, the watch has begun, and maybe read a few pages, stretch, or simply breathe in the dark. You're doing something humans did for centuries, honoring the night instead of fighting it. Let's step inside a medieval home. The walls are rough timber and smoke-stained stone. The air smells faintly of soot and damp straw. There's a low crackle of firelight and the rhythmic breath of people sleeping shoulder to shoulder. Privacy didn't exist. You weren't alone in your room. You were a body among bodies. Sleep was a communal act, not a private indulgence. A typical peasant's bed was called a pallet, a sack stuffed with straw or hay, if you could afford a sack at all. Otherwise it was just straw on the floor, damp, flattened, possibly claimed by a cat. It wasn't luxury, but it was insulation. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and surprisingly warm. It was also, unfortunately, an excellent Airbnb for fleas. If the itching started, you ignored it. If it bit, you shifted slightly and prayed for peace. A family with a few more coins or a stronger back might raise the pallet onto a wooden frame. It didn't change much, but it kept your face farther from whatever crawled underneath. Most people didn't own sheets. They slept in the same clothes they wore all day, their garments stiff with work and smoke. There were no pajamas, no nightgowns, no concept of sleepwear. The body was what you had. The clothes were what you kept. And everyone slept together, parents, children, sometimes even the livestock. Warmth was communal, and so was the smell. If you got too hot, you rolled toward the edge, only to find the draft from the window cutting through the room like a knife. If you got too cold, you rolled back toward the pile of limbs and blankets. There was no ideal temperature, just negotiation. For nobles, things looked grander but not necessarily cleaner. They slept in large carved beds, raised high off the ground, piled with feather mattresses and embroidered linens. Canopies hung like private fortresses, keeping out the cold and, with luck, the lice. These beds were heirlooms, so valuable they were listed in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited someone's favorite mattress, lumps included. But even among silk sheets, the purpose of sleep was the same: survival. You didn't lie down to rest. You lay down to not freeze. The medieval bed wasn't about luxury. It was about making it to morning. As the embers dimmed, another small ritual began, one as common as breathing. People reached for their nightcaps, not the drink but the cloth. A long drooping hat, usually wool or linen, pulled down tight to keep the heat from fleeing their heads. Medieval homes were built for permanence, not comfort. Stone walls that sweated cold, roofs that sighed with every gust, windows patched with horn or parchment that let in more draught than light. So warmth became an art form, a hat, a cloak, a shared body. Nightcaps looked ridiculous, but they worked. The long tip sometimes doubled as a scarf. People wound it under their chin or around their neck to trap whatever heat remained. And when you picture a man in a long gown and pointed cap, shuffling to the door with a candle, yes, that stereotype is historically correct. Answering the door in a nightcap was the medieval way of saying business hours are over. Women's headwear carried more rules. Modesty didn't end when the candles went out. Married women were expected to keep their heads covered even in bed. Some did so from faith, others from habit, most because everyone else did. And for the wealthy, even sleep demanded presentation. Silk embroidery, colored tassels, tiny jewels. Your nightcap could be a silent sermon on status. But as strange as these customs sound, they served a purpose deeper than fashion. At night, vulnerability was a religion. The darkness erased hierarchy. A lord and a shepherd, once the torches died, were equally cold, equally blind. And so they wrapped themselves in rituals, fabric, prayer, superstition, anything that felt like armor against the unseen. Picture the moment before sleep. The fire burns low. Shadows bend across the wall like breathing things. You whisper a short prayer, not to rest better, but to die properly if it comes to that. Every night was a rehearsal for eternity. The most famous bedtime prayer, still whispered by children centuries later, was born from that fear. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. It sounds like comfort now, but then it was paperwork for the soul, a nightly insurance policy against damnation. You didn't light scented candles or play white noise music. You confessed, forgave, repented. The bed was your chapel, the blanket your shroud. In monasteries, the last service of the day was called compline, a final devotion before silence. Afterward, monks took a vow not to speak until dawn. The world retreated into stillness, the kind of stillness that hummed. Even outside the monastery, villagers kept the habit, whispering small psalms, murmuring names of saints who guarded sleepers from nightmares, thieves, and worse. If you think modern anxiety is new, try falling asleep in a wooden house lit by an open flame while the plague moves through town. Yet, for all that fear, the medieval night was also beautiful. It had texture, layers of sound and scent we've forgotten, the pop of burning resin, the soft hiss of wind through a thatched roof, the rhythmic breathing of animals below the floorboards, and above it all the slow toll of church bells marking the hours. Every ring was both reassurance and reminder. Time belonged to God, and you were only borrowing it. People didn't resent the dark. They respected it. They believed dreams were messages, from heaven, from spirits, from guilt. Some kept notebooks of visions. Others sought meaning from priests. The border between sleep and revelation was thin, and many crossed it nightly. At midnight, when the watch ended, the second sleep began. The fire was stirred. Bodies resettled. Dogs sighed. Children mumbled and turned. Outside, frost thickened on fields, and the moon rose like a pale coin tossed into the sky. Within that silence, humanity rested, messy, faithful, afraid, alive. When morning came, it didn't so much arrive as creep. The light pushed its way through shutters, pale and slow, illuminating smoke hanging in the air. Someone coughed. Someone stirred the ashes. Roosters began their eternal argument with time itself. A new day started exactly as the last one had ended, with work. But between those two labors, between dusk and dawn, lay a fragile kind of peace, the medieval night when sleep was not escape but survival, and rest itself felt holy. Some nights the watch felt like a hidden village. A baker rose to set dough. A mother mended a sleeve by embers. An old man paced the threshold against the rain. In winter, neighbors traded coal so no hearth failed. In summer, doors stayed latched, and voices drifted between cottages like birds. Fast days made suppers lean and dreams sharp. Feast eves stretched with songs, prayers, and stories retold until the ash went silver. Comets were read as warnings, wolves as omens, and floods as sermons from the river. Yet by habit and hope, the tide of night returned to its shape. First sleep, watch, second sleep. Wake, work, repeat, the oldest clock in the world. In the modern world, sleeping alone is a badge of independence, a private luxury, wrapped in silence and blanket control. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping alone was not noble. It was suspicious, impractical, even dangerous. The night was a living thing, unpredictable and often hostile. If the cold didn't reach you, the shadows might. Warmth was the simplest reason for companionship. Bodies meant heat, and heat meant survival. But it wasn't just physical comfort that kept people close. It was moral safety. A lone sleeper was considered spiritually vulnerable, exposed to temptation or worse, possession. Company provided a kind of moral insulation. If the devil came calling, at least someone else could witness the struggle, or, depending on luck, serve as an easier target. Children almost never slept alone. Their world was full of stories about ghosts, fairies, and restless souls that wandered the night. Every creak in the floorboards had a name. Every gust of wind was a whisper from the other side. To send a child to bed alone would have been cruel and unthinkable. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or traveling guests. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Even monks sworn to silence and devotion slept side by side in long rows of wooden cots. In some monasteries, being made to sleep alone was a disciplinary punishment. Isolation was the first step towards sin, they believed. Solitude bred temptation, and temptation led to confession. The logic was perfectly medieval. Solitary sleep invited the devil. Shared sleep ensured accountability. Have you ever nodded off sitting up, in class, on a bus, maybe waiting for an appointment, and woken with your neck locked in protest? For medieval people, that wasn't an accident. It was policy. Some nobles, scholars, and devout believers made a habit of sleeping upright as though gravity itself were sinful. They had reasons, strange ones. Lying flat, they believed, compressed the lungs, spoiled digestion, and encouraged bad humors to settle in the chest. It also resembled death too closely for comfort. A fully horizontal body invited the grim reaper's attention, so they propped themselves on piles of cushions or even sat half-reclined on benches, their heads lolling forward in the shadow of candlelight. A monk might sleep sitting on a wooden stool, hood drawn over his face, hands folded. It wasn't about comfort, it was about control. To sleep deeply was to risk dreaming, and dreams were dangerous. Dreams were windows through which demons whispered. So they fought sleep like a temptation, nodding off only when exhaustion proved stronger than faith. In wealthy homes, elaborate sleeping chairs were carved for this purpose, part seat, part coffin, all discomfort. Pillows were stuffed behind the back, legs wrapped in blankets, hands kept visible just in case. If you've ever fallen asleep watching TV in a chair and woken with your arm numb, congratulations. You've accidentally reenacted a 14th century devotional practice. Then there were the bedfellows no one wanted, fleas, lice, and the silent terror known as the bedbug. Hygiene in the medieval era was charitably inconsistent. Baths were rare, laundry expensive, and soap, when it existed, was harsh and unreliable. Combine that with straw bedding, shared sleeping quarters, and the occasional chicken wandering through the house, and you had paradise for parasites. Fleas and lice were so common, they were practically domestic companions. People joked about them, cursed them, occasionally named them. Even nobles weren't spared. Many had servants whose sole job was to pick lice from their master's hair and clothing, a kind of medieval spa treatment with tweezers. The bedbug, however, was in a league of its own. It hid in wood seams, mattress folds, and stone cracks, waiting for the dark. At night it crept out like a tiny vampire. The next morning you'd find the evidence, small red welts like punctuation marks left by the night. Nightcaps and full-length sleeping garments weren't just for warmth. They were armor, a barrier between flesh and infestation. People burned herbs like wormwood and yarrow to drive pests away, or sprinkled their beds with garlic, onion, or even ashes. It probably didn't help, but it gave the illusion of control, and obliterated any chance of romance. Fleas became literary metaphors for sin. Poets wrote love verses comparing two bitten lovers to souls joined in blood. It sounds grotesque, but in a world without antibiotics or perfume, you used what you had. So while modern sleep is disturbed by buzzing phones or glowing streetlights, medieval sleep was broken by scratching, twitching, and the unsettling certainty that something, or several somethings, were crawling under the blanket with you. Sleeping in armor, though, that was real. Not common, but real. Knights on campaign or in hostile territory often slept partially armed. Removing all your armor was tempting fate. Raids, ambushes, and betrayal didn't wait for daylight. A knight might strip his helmet and gauntlets, but keep his chainmail or breastplate. Imagine trying to rest while wearing 50 pounds of iron. Rolling over was impossible. Every movement echoed. It was like trying to nap inside a cutlery drawer. Still, in dangerous lands, discomfort was survival. Under siege, soldiers slept beside their weapons, blades within reach, armor polished by the flicker of firelight. In castles surrounded by enemies, the line between bed and battlefield blurred. Iron didn't breathe. Stone floors froze. The night was not a lullaby. It was a vigil. For travelers, inns were the lesser evil. Picture it. A smoky room, a single fire, and a dozen strangers crammed into one long bed or floor pallet. Privacy, none. Cleanliness, theoretical. A traveler was lucky to claim a few inches of straw. Sharing a bed with strangers wasn't rude. It was expected. You'd climb into whatever space remained, careful not to disturb your neighbor, who might be a priest, a blacksmith, or someone with far too many boils. If you found the situation awkward, the innkeeper might remind you, the road offers colder company. Pickpocketing was common, so travelers slept with their money belts tied tight or tucked under their arms. Some even slept on their bundles, using them as both pillow and alarm system. And yet, for all the filth and snoring, it was safer than sleeping outside, where wolves, thieves, and worse waited for those foolish enough to dream under open skies. Sleepwalking added another layer of horror. Today we call it stress. In the 14th century it was witchcraft. A person wandering the halls at night in a white gown, candle in hand, eyes empty. That was enough to send a village into chaos. People whispered of possession, curses, or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from prayer to bondage. Families tied sleepwalkers to their chairs or beds. Some hung iron charms near doors and windows, believing the metal would repel spirits. Others simply accepted it as a family curse and kept water nearby for sprinkling, in case the wanderer started climbing the roof again. Priests debated whether sins committed in sleep counted. The answer was complicated. If the body sinned, but the soul didn't know who paid the price. No one wanted to test the theory, and then came the soundscape of the night. Darkness in the Middle Ages was never silent. Church bells tolled every few hours, calling monks to prayer. Dogs barked. Wind scraped against shutters. The world breathed in wood and iron and thunder. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams had a soundtrack. Chants echoing down stone halls, bells chiming for matins at 2 or 3 in the morning. If a storm rolled in, the whole house became a drum. Roofs leaked, chimneys howled, and flashes of lightning painted the walls with trembling light. People crossed themselves, muttered prayers, and waited for the rage of heaven to pass. Outside, wolves howled, not poetic ones, real ones. Inside, someone stirred the coals and checked the door latch. The night was long, but life demanded endurance. Even in the worst years and famine, plague, war, people still slept. It might have been uneasy, shared, infested, or interrupted, but it was sleep nonetheless. And in that simple act of closing their eyes, they defied the chaos around them. Morning was the world's forgiveness. The first shaft of light through the shutters turned every surviving breath into a victory. Someone yawned, someone prayed, someone cursed the rooster. And life, impossibly, went on. To sleep in the medieval world was not to rest but to endure. The bed was a battlefield, the blanket a shield, the body a prayer. Every dawn was a resurrection, and in a time when night meant danger, simply waking up was a small silent miracle. Section, the sacred chaos of sleep, the medieval bed, was never a sanctuary of comfort. It was more like a truce between your body and the cold, a peace treaty negotiated with straw, feathers, and occasionally something that squeaked. You didn't lie down to rest. You lay down not to freeze, not to get pecked by a chicken, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of someday sleeping on something that didn't rustle or cluck. When we say nightcap today, we picture a cozy drink by the fire, whiskey, a blanket, a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't liquid. It was literal. It was a hat, a long, droopy, often ridiculous piece of cloth whose main job was to stop your skull from turning into an icicle. Because medieval architecture was never praised for its insulation. Cold stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of stretched animal horn or oiled parchment didn't keep the chill out. Central heating did exist, and it barked. Since warmth escaped fastest through the head, everyone from peasants to nobles wore something to bed. The most iconic style was long and pointed, like something a part-time wizard might wear. They were made of wool, linen, or whatever scrap of fabric could be spared without offending the family goat. For men it was practical. For women it doubled as a head covering. Part modesty, part hygiene, and mostly camouflage for hair that hadn't seen soap since Easter. Nightcaps also carried social meaning. In some areas, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, even while sleeping. The embroidery or color could hint at wealth, status, or simply a love of tiny flags. Because in the Middle Ages nothing said "I've made it" like going to bed wearing your own banner. In towns, the hat took on new symbolism. It meant off-duty. If you opened the door wearing one, it was the polite medieval way of saying, "Go away." And yes, the hat absolutely meant that. Nightcaps usually came with long nightshirts, baggy, itchy, flammable tunics that made everyone look like Scrooge before his haunting. Practical, shapeless, and sometimes singed, not seductive but survival gear. Because in a home where the wind whistled through the walls, you needed all the fabric you could find. Today, sharing a bed with strangers happens only on red-eye flights or in sketchy hostels. But for the medieval traveler, it was standard procedure. Imagine being a merchant or a pilgrim whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You stumble into an inn, a miracle by itself, and ask for a bed. What you get is not a room, not a mattress to yourself, but a section of a bed that's already occupied. Beds were communal. They were like wells, markets, or gossip, shared by necessity. 2, 3, even 4 people might pile in, depending on space and tolerance. Big inns had dormitory-style halls, rows of straw mattresses with no hint of privacy. Snoring wasn't judged. Elbow territory was fiercely defended. Some inns tried to group guests by trade. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. Usually it was first come, first sprawled. And while that sounds horrific to modern ears, it was still better than sleeping outside with wolves, rain, and whatever else wanted to chew on you. Theft was common, of course. Travelers tied their purses to their belts or tucked them under their shirts. Some slept directly on top of their belongings, a pillow and alarm system in one. If your bundle moved, so did your trust in humanity. The rich naturally avoided all this. Nobles traveled with entourages and personal bedding, setting up mini palaces wherever they went. If they had to stay in an inn, they demanded their own room, not for safety but for dignity. Sleep to them wasn't survival, it was performance. For everyone else, sleep was a spiritual act, a rehearsal for death. Closing your eyes meant surrendering your soul for the night, and there was no guarantee it would return. So before lying down, you didn't check your phone. You checked your conscience. Confession, prayer, repentance. Nightly rituals against eternal uncertainty. Forget lavender candles or meditation apps. Medieval bedtime was a legal negotiation with God. That sweet little children's prayer, "If I should die before I wake." So was a genuine clause in the contract. Each night you signed off on your life. Adults had whole repertoires of prayers for different dangers, guilt, nightmares, plague, or demons in the rafters. Each verse was a firewall against hellfire. Some invoked saints to guard their dreams, celestial bouncers watching the club door of your soul. Others mumbled psalms as a kind of last-minute repentance, spiritual insurance in case the morning didn't come. Monks and nuns ended their day with compline, the final service before silence. After that, no talking until dawn, not out of discipline but exhaustion. Silence wasn't piety, it was mercy. Children were also taught to pray, partly for salvation, partly to stop them from asking why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reassured them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it meant divine surveillance. Bedtime wasn't peaceful. It was cautious. Modern minds treat dreams as nonsense, the brain-cleaning house, filing papers, or running bad theater in the dark. Medieval minds saw them as serious business. Dreams were messages, divine, demonic, or digestive. Fire symbolized hell, water purity or drowning. And if you dreamt of a goat-headed man juggling fish, you didn't analyze it. You called a priest. Dreams were dissected like sacred texts. Monks wrote entire books interpreting their own night visions. Some were praised as holy seers. Others were told to stop eating onions. Your soul, they believed, stayed active while your body rested, wandering through invisible realms. Whatever you did there reflected who you truly were. A sinful act in a dream could mean hidden guilt. A holy dream could mark you as chosen. The church predictably urged caution. Not every dream came from God. Some were the devil's tricks. So if your dreams turned too vivid, too indulgent, or too suggestive, the solution was prayer, fasting, and possibly moving your bed away from the fireplace fumes. And then came the animals. Today, sleeping with your pet is a quirky habit. Back then, it was survival. Stone houses held the cold like a coffin, and central heating was spelled PIG. Families often shared their sleeping space with livestock, sometimes in the same room, sometimes in the same straw heap. Dogs curled by your feet. Chickens wandered in the dark. A pig snored softly near the fire. It wasn't affection, it was thermodynamics. Every creature contributed to the fight against the cold. If you were lucky, you woke up warm. If not, you woke up bitten. Still, it worked. That shared heat carried people through winters so brutal that ink froze and rivers turned to glass. So when you imagine the medieval sleeper, don't picture elegance. Picture endurance. A world where sleep was a risk, warmth a privilege, and waking up was a miracle. They didn't rest to recover. They rested to continue. A dog wasn't just a pet in medieval nights. It was a heater with fur. A single hound by the bedside could save your toes from turning blue, and if a cow happened to live in the corner, congratulations. Your room temperature just went up by 1 degree, a miracle by January standards. For most of Europe's poor, the home was one room that did everything: cook, eat, pray, argue, and eventually die in. The whole family, and half the livestock, squeezed into that shared space. Children nestled between their parents and a goat, while a chicken strutted freely, serving as both company and alarm clock. As for hygiene, well, let's not dig too deep. For the wealthy, things looked a little less barn-like. Nobles didn't usually sleep beside livestock, though a pampered lapdog or two might still share the sheets. Not for warmth, mind you, but for fashion, prestige, and the occasional redistribution of fleas. Some castles even built private quarters for their favorite animals, because nothing says absolute power like a dog with its own bedroom and title. Still, sleeping with animals came with its challenges. They snored, they kicked, and they had no concept of personal boundaries. But medieval people were used to it. A hoof to the face at 3 in the morning wasn't a catastrophe, it was simply Tuesday. If you've ever shared a hostel bunk and thought, "This is a bit much," allow me to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, where comfort went to die, quietly under a vow of silence, personal space, None. Softness. Heresy. The typical monastery housed dozens of monks in a single stone hall, each assigned a wooden plank, masquerading as a bed. If the abbot was feeling generous, or it was a feast day, a thin straw layer might be added for luxury. Monks slept fully dressed, not out of modesty, but out of self-preservation. Getting changed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was worse than just sleeping ready. Their robes, belts, and sandals doubled as both spiritual armor and disappointing insulation. If you got cold, you layered. If you got hot, you offered it up to God. Pillows? None. Curtains? Don't be ridiculous. Conversation? A sin. Silence wasn't suggested. It was law enforced by the rule of Saint Benedict. Groan too loudly, and you might earn a week of chamber pot duty. Snoring, however, occupied a moral grey area. You couldn't control it, but if it got too disruptive, you might face divine judgment, or at least an elbow from your neighbor. The lighting was dim, maybe one candle flickering in the corner. You didn't need to see. You only needed to stay still and avoid sinning. That was the entire nightly mission. Despite the austerity, monks saw their hard beds as spiritual training, a rehearsal for eternity by denying the flesh any pleasure. Sleep wasn't rest. It was discipline. Every minute of slumber was monitored, scheduled, and accounted for. Some monks even slept sitting upright to avoid the temptation of dreams, or tragically blood circulation. Next to that, a peasant's straw mattress and a snoring pig seemed positively luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge. Now imagine something that would horrify most modern sleepers, waking up on purpose at 2 a.m., not for a bathroom trip, not for a scroll through bad news, for prayer. Loud, cold, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was not a punishment. It was policy. Monks and nuns lived by the canonical hours, a rigid schedule dividing the day and night into sacred segments. One of those was matins, the first service of the day, which began long before dawn, when even owls were still debating whether to wake up. The bell would toll, usually rung by whichever unlucky soul had drawn the short straw, and the entire dormitory of bleary-eyed brothers would rise in silence. They shuffled through the halls toward the chapel, still fully clothed. Pajamas were for the weak. The only layering system that mattered was spiritual. Inside the chapel, under flickering candlelight and the echoing stone arches, they chanted psalms, recited scripture, and tried not to collapse from exhaustion. Falling asleep mid-prayer was a known occupational hazard, and yes, there were penalties. Those caught nodding off might be assigned extra chores, or worse, more prayers. You fell asleep in matins? Congratulations. You're leading the next one. Services could last an hour or more, sometimes 2, depending on the zeal of the order. Picture it. You haven't eaten since a bowl of lentils and regret. Your stomach is protesting and your soul is barely keeping your body upright. Still you chant. Still you endure. When the service ended, some monks returned to their planks for second sleep. Others, especially in stricter orders, skipped rest entirely and went straight to study or manual labor. Because nothing said holy dedication like threshing grain after 4 fragmented hours of sleep. Why so early? Because comfort was a temptation. The night's silence, the cold absolute, and undisturbed, was considered the perfect time to speak with God before the sun, the noise, or the sins of the world woke up. The quiet hours of the medieval night, if you lived in the Middle Ages. Sleep wasn't just a biological necessity. It was a delicate negotiation with darkness itself. Every night was a quiet truce between fear, faith, and fatigue. The world beyond your wooden door wasn't merely silent. It was alive with things better left unseen. Spirits, thieves, rats, and rumors. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the damp scent of straw. And as the fire faded to embers, you lay there, one eye half open, hoping that both dawn and your soul would return intact. The bed, if you were lucky enough to have one, was not the plush sanctuary we imagine today. It was a creaking structure of wood and rope, holding a mattress filled with straw, reeds, or if you were rich, feathers, carefully plucked and refilled over generations. The rope sagged, the straw itched, and the smell was medieval. A good night's rest meant surviving the night without coughing, scratching, or acquiring a new parasite. In many homes, beds were shared, and not always with people you chose. Fellow servant, a child, a distant cousin, perhaps even a guest of the manor, all bundled together under one woolen cover. Privacy was not a luxury of the era. It was an unknown concept. If warmth was the goal, animals were the solution. A large dog might guard your feet from freezing. A cow in the corner could raise the temperature by a blessed degree or two. Children nestled between parents and livestock, like living bricks in a wall against the cold. Chickens roamed freely, clucking softly in the dark. If one decided to hop onto the bed, it wasn't alarming. It was Tuesday. The smell? Questionable. The hygiene? Let's not talk about it. Survival was the priority. The wealthy, of course, pretended otherwise. They had proper beds, grand wooden frames with carved posts and canopies thick enough to block drafts, and the sight of servants stoking fires at midnight. They slept with lapdogs not for warmth but for fashion, their small bodies serving as status symbols and mobile flea distribution systems. Some castles even had special sleeping quarters for you, beloved animals, and because nothing declared your power quite like a dog with its own bedchamber. Yet even the grandest beds couldn't silence the sounds of the night. The wind slipping through the shutters, the echo of distant bells, the whispers of the fearful and the faithful. For the monks and nuns who lived within cloisters, the night was never truly theirs to rest in. The monastic dormitory was a cold, echoing chamber, lined with wooden cots where dozens of robed figures lay in neat, disciplined rows. They slept fully clothed, belts fastened, sandals still strapped. Comfort was a temptation. Pillows were rare, laughter rarer. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, silence wasn't a suggestion, it was sacred law. Even groaning in one's sleep could lead to penance. If you snored too loudly, you might wake to find yourself assigned to clean the chamber pots. Divine justice for earthly noise. At the toll of a bell, often in the blackest hour of night, the monks would rise. Not for breakfast, not for chores, but for matins, the midnight prayer. Cold, hungry eyes half shut, they would shuffle toward the chapel, each step echoing off the stone floors. There, by candlelight, the air thick with incense and exhaustion, they would chant psalms to the rhythm of eternity. The goal was not rest, but redemption. To give the stillest hours of the night to God was the ultimate devotion, or at least it was, once you stopped nodding off mid-prayer. Records survive of monks being punished for dozing during worship. The punishment? More prayer. You fell asleep during matins, the abbot would say, so now you'll lead the next one. The logic was circular, but so was their faith. For common folk, the night had its own rituals. Before lying down, people would murmur prayers, not to sleep peacefully, but to die properly, if it came to that. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take, was not poetic exaggeration. It was a sincere contingency plan. Death visited casually in the 13th century, by plague, by childbirth, by a bad oyster. Sleep was simply rehearsal. You confessed, you prayed, and you hoped to wake up still among the living. Children were taught that angels watched over them, which sounds charming until you realize it meant celestial surveillance, not comfort. Parents reminded them that sin could find its way even into dreams, so best to go to bed clean, in both body and spirit. But dreams were tricky business. In the medieval mind, They weren't just harmless nonsense conjured by cheese or fatigue. They were messages, sometimes divine, sometimes infernal, and occasionally dietary. A dream of fire could signal damnation, a dream of water, purification, a dream involving a goat juggling fish, immediate consultation with the local priest. Monks and scholars filled entire manuscripts decoding symbols from nightly visions, mapping the subconscious as if it were a battlefield between heaven and hell. Even the act of dreaming was moral territory. If you dreamed of sin, it might mean you had sinned in spirit and confession was in order. Others saw dreams as holy visions, the soul's chance to receive truth unfiltered by flesh. A peasant might dream of angels and be praised as blessed. Or he might dream of his neighbor's wife and wake up scheduled for repentance. Either way, sleep wasn't safe, nor was it quiet. The night was a chorus of life and discomfort. Lice and fleas itched with tireless piety. Bedbugs feasted on the devout and the damned alike. People burned herbs, stuffed garlic under pillows, or sprinkled ashes across mattresses in futile defiance. The smell alone could exorcise romance from any shared bed. Fleas even found their way into poetry. One Elizabethan verse, itself an echo of older medieval wit, compares lovers joined by a flea's bite as the ultimate union. Morbid maybe, but practical. Passion and pestilence were rarely far apart, and still people slept, because what else could they do? Work began at dawn, prayers earlier still, and the human body, even when crawling with company, eventually surrendered to fatigue. Not everyone, however, surrendered gracefully. There were those who rose in the middle of the night, eyes glazed, steps heavy, wandering through rooms like ghosts. Today we'd call it sleepwalking. Then it was something darker. To move while unconscious was proof of possession, a sign that your soul had left its post. Neighbors would whisper of curses or demons. Remedies ranged from herbal smoke to iron charms hung above the bed. Some unfortunate souls were even tied to chairs for safety. Homes were full of open fires and sharp tools, and not everyone survived their own midnight pilgrimages. There are stories of sleepwalkers climbing rooftops or wandering into churches, seen as both terrifying and holy. Afterward, a priest would perform cleansing prayers, just in case heaven was still keeping score. And then there were the knights, poor, exhausted men who slept with one eye open and one hand on their sword. Sleeping in armor wasn't standard practice, but in war or on campaign, it was survival. Imagine trying to rest wrapped in steel, your every movement a symphony of clanking misery, chainmail pinched, plates chafed, and the floor beneath you was more rock than bed, but you slept anyway because dawn might bring a siege. Some soldiers slept sitting up, helmets beside them, shields beneath their heads like heavy pillows. Others napped in partial armor, enough to survive a surprise attack, but not enough to breathe comfortably. The sound of metal shifting in the dark could wake an entire barracks, hearts pounding, hands grasping for swords that doubled as bedtime companions. For merchants and travelers, the challenge was different. Safety was uncertain, and inns were rare. Her room was often just space on a shared bed, and sometimes not even that. Strangers slept side by side, boots still on, purses tied to belts to deter thieves. If you moved someone's bag, it meant you were about to make a new enemy. Yet compared to freezing outside, it was paradise. The warmth of bodies, the crackle of the hearth, the snores of strangers, it was all part of the human symphony of survival. In the silence that followed, as dawn crept across the thatch roofs and the first rooster announced the day, people stirred. Another night survived. Another deal struck between body and soul. They rose, stretched, crossed themselves, and went back to work, plowing, praying, weaving, sinning, repenting, and eventually sleeping again. Because no matter how uncomfortable, how crowded, how infested or divine, The medieval night always ended the same way, in the fragile mercy of morning light. The night's whisper, from sleepwalkers to Salem Imagine. Waking in the middle of the night to the faint creak of wood and the flicker of candlelight. You turn your head, and there, drifting silently across the room, is a man in a long nightshirt holding a candle, eyes glazed, murmuring Latin he never actually learned, stepping carefully over the livestock asleep by the hearth. In the 14th century, that scene didn't mean sleep disorder. It meant possession, or maybe heresy, possibly both. And depending on your local priest's mood, an exorcism might be arranged before breakfast. Sleepwalking, or noctambulism, as later scholars named it, baffled the medieval mind. Some physicians said it was caused by bad humors, particularly an excess of black bile, which was their favorite explanation for everything from toothache to treason. Others believed the soul briefly escaped the body during sleep, leaving the flesh to wander clumsily through the world like a lost animal. Either way, it wasn't something you ignored. Families tried every cure the human imagination could conjure. Herbal concoctions brewed with mugwort or sage were burned near the bed. Iron charms were hung from beams. Psalms were whispered over the sleeper's head. In some homes, a more direct approach was taken, a rope tied from the ankle to a chair leg, so the dreamer couldn't get far. Extreme, maybe. But remember, these were homes with open fires, exposed knives, and chamber pots just waiting to be kicked over. Survival required creativity. Reports spread of people climbing rooftops in their sleep. Whether truth or rumor didn't matter. The fear was real. Windows were barred. Priests debated whether a man could sin unconsciously. If a person cursed or blasphemed mid-dream, did his soul share the guilt? Theologians wrote about it, debated it, and finally agreed on nothing. Meanwhile, most sleepwalkers did nothing more dramatic than shuffle about, mutter a few nonsense prayers, and reach for doors that didn't exist. Still, if someone wandered into a church in their sleep, villagers took it seriously. It was either divine intervention or a devil's prank, and both required cleansing rituals, just in case heaven was keeping score. To survive the medieval night, you had to learn one essential skill, the art of sleeping through chaos. Church bells, thunder, livestock, screams, it was all part of the background hum. For those half-starved, overworked, sleep-deprived souls, this was the medieval version of white noise. The bells came first. Church bells marked every holy rhythm of the day. Sunrise, prayer hours, meals, and of course, the unholy hour of matins, somewhere around 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams came scored to a soundtrack of regular tolling. At some point, the brain simply surrendered. Bells became lullabies, metallic reminders that time belonged to God, not you. Then there were the storms. Without glass windows or weather forecasts, thunder was an event, not a sound. Every flash of lightning lit the world like Judgment Day. Roofs leaked, chimneys howled, and the wind slipped through every crack in the wall. People huddled under blankets that smelled faintly of smoke, animals, and sin, waiting for the noise to fade. And yet they slept, because they had to. Insomnia was not an option when your survival depended on rising at dawn. No one cared if you'd had a rough night. The field still needed plowing. The prayers still needed saying, and somewhere, probably, a Viking raid needed escaping. Even disaster didn't always interrupt bedtime. During famine, war, and plague, people still found ways to sleep. In the 14th century, the carts that carried the dead through town were as common as the rooster's call. Morning might bring the smell of ash and decay, but it also meant you'd live to see another day. If you didn't wake up, well, some called that mercy. There are accounts of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Chronic exhaustion had rewired their endurance. When your days were spent dodging hunger, taxes, and damnation, The body simply gave in. Sleep became both surrender and defiance, the only moment when a peasant could be equal to a king. And then there were those who used sleep as escape. When sickness, grief, or divine terror became unbearable, people simply wrapped themselves in cloaks, whispered a prayer, and drifted into unconscious refuge. It was a kind of faith, a belief that if the world ended tonight, at least you'd miss the worst of it. In that quiet acceptance was something almost wise, a surrender not to despair but to rest. Centuries later, that same human tension, fear, belief, exhaustion, found a new stage. The year was 1692, and across the Atlantic, in the Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, the darkness had taken on a different shape. The people of Salem were devout, strict and terrified of the unseen. They believed they were building a holy city watched by God and stalked by Satan. Their world was small, snowbound cottages, frozen fields, and minds steeped in scripture. After years of failed crops, smallpox outbreaks, and wars with native tribes, the community was frayed. Resentment simmered. Neighbors distrusted neighbors. Fear had only been waiting for a spark. That spark came from the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris. His young daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams began to act strangely. They screamed, convulsed, threw things, and claimed invisible forces were tormenting them. When the village doctor William Griggs found no physical cause, he gave a diagnosis that would set the world on fire: witchcraft. And just like that, Salem's sleepless night began. In a place where witches were as real as wolves, the idea spread fast. If the devil could reach the minister's house, no one was safe. The afflicted girls, encouraged by adults hungry for answers, began to name names. At first they accused the outcasts, beggars, widows, women who didn't fit the Puritan mold. Sarah Good, a poor woman known for muttering to herself, became a target. People said her whispers were curses. Sarah Osborne, who had scandalized the town by marrying her servant, was next. And then came Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados whose accent and stories frightened the villagers. Under pressure, perhaps even under threat of violence, Tituba confessed. But her confession didn't end the hysteria. It unleashed it. She spoke of a tall man in black, of strange animals, and of a book where witches signed their names in blood. And worst of all, she said there were others in Salem. That was all it took. Fear, once given a face, grows like ivy. Soon the accusations multiplied. Every quarrel, every dead cow, every sick child found a new explanation. Witchcraft. Spectral evidence, the claim that someone's ghostly image had appeared in a dream, was now admissible in court. You couldn't argue against a nightmare. If someone said they saw your spirit choking them, that was enough to hang you. Reality and superstition became indistinguishable. Guilt was proven by hysteria, and to defend the accused was to join them on the gallows. The trials that followed were not trials at all. They were theatre, grim, desperate theatre. Girls screamed and collapsed in fits when the accused entered the room. If a suspect looked at them, they shrieked. If they didn't look at them, they shrieked louder. The judges, men of scripture supposedly immune to folly, took every cry as proof. Logic slept. Fear ruled. As the months passed, the hangings began. One by one, the condemned stood on the gallows under grey skies, swearing their innocence. Some prayed, some cursed. All met the same silence as the trapdoors opened. By autumn, the hysteria had consumed the village, and when it finally burned itself out, only guilt remained, and heavy, invisible, and impossible to wash away. Salem's nightmare ended where it began, in exhaustion. Fear had robbed them of reason, of trust, and of sleep. It was the same battle humanity had always fought, between belief and terror, light and darkness, consciousness and the things that move without it. Whether it was a monk half asleep at matins, a peasant walking in his dreams, or a Puritan trembling in the snow, every age faces the same long night, the kind where faith becomes both comfort and curse, and sleep at last is the only form of forgiveness left. Part 6. The breaking of the spell. By the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer a village, it was a stage. The accused no longer entered courtrooms, they were dragged there. Chains clanked like punctuation between prayers. There were no defense lawyers because the idea didn't exist. If you stood before the judges, you stood alone. To deny was to be damned. To confess was to survive, but only if you handed them another name. The system had learned to feed on itself. It rewarded falsehood, punished silence, and devoured truth. The trials had become theater, grim and irresistible. Crowds traveled from neighboring towns to watch. Mothers brought their children. Vendors sold bread outside the courthouse. The spectacle of accusation had become entertainment disguised as piety. Each new confession was another act in a play that no one dared to stop. Not everyone believed, of course. In whispered corners, doubt spread. A few dared to ask why only widows, beggars, and outspoken women seemed to attract the devil's attention. But to question the court was to question God himself, and that in Salem was blasphemy. Reason had fled. The law no longer judged, it echoed fear. The first body to hang was Bridget Bishop on June 10th. Her reputation made her easy prey. She wore red, too bright. She owned a tavern, too sinful. Years before, she'd already been accused once, and though she survived that, her fate had only been delayed. Witnesses claimed her ghost pinched them in the night, that their livestock died when she passed by, that she kept dolls filled with curses. She denied everything. It didn't matter. The verdict was written before she spoke. At Gallows Hill, beneath a grey sky and an indifferent wind, the rope was pulled. No prayer, no mercy. Just silence, the kind that comes after justice stops breathing. Then the killings gathered pace. On July 19th, 5 women followed her to the gallows. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some were poor, others respected, all condemned. Rebecca Nurse's hanging shook the colony. She was elderly, gentle, beloved. The jury had first declared her not guilty, but the afflicted girls collapsed in a frenzy on the courtroom floor, and the judges reversed their decision. When she was led to the noose, she whispered her final words, "I am as innocent as the child unborn." The wind carried them away before the rope tightened. In Salem, innocence had lost all currency. August brought more. September worse. On the 22nd, 8 souls died in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, who had doubted the trials from the start. Her husband, Giles Corey, refused even to plead. Without a plea, the court could not condemn him, so they crushed him instead. Stones piled on his chest one by one for 3 days. "More weight," he gasped before the final stone. It was defiance turned into legend. By the time the leaves began to fall, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and 5 more had wasted away in jail. 200 others stood accused. The gallows no longer cast shadows only on the hill. They reached into every home, every conversation, every prayer. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold. While the executions filled the headlines of the soul, the prisons filled with the forgotten. Salem's tiny jail couldn't hold them all. Cells overflowed with the smell of sweat, mold, and despair. Some were sent to nearby towns, Ipswich, Boston, chained to stone walls, starving, freezing, waiting for a trial that might never come. Most weren't witches. They were neighbors, parents, children, ordinary people caught in extraordinary madness. Their crimes were small things, a quarrel over land, a rejected suitor, a misplaced look. A pig died? Witchcraft, a baby cried during prayer. Possession. Logic had been buried beside the victims. Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, knew this madness too well. Released once by the court, she was rearrested days later after the girls convulsed anew. In her final plea, she didn't beg for her life. She begged the judges to stop. "I ask not for my own deliverance, but that no more innocent blood be shed." She was hanged soon after, and then there was Dorothy Good, barely 4 years old. The daughter of Sarah Good, she confessed under questioning. A terrified child echoing the words adults wanted to hear. They locked her in a dungeon, bound in chains for 8 months. When she emerged, she was silent, broken, and would never recover. Even children had become fuel for the fire. Pregnant women, too, were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of the outspoken John Proctor, was found guilty, but her execution delayed until after childbirth. Her baby saved her. Her husband's courage did not. John Proctor was hanged that August. His last words of prayer and a protest mingled together. By autumn, even the devout had begun to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. This was not God's work. It was man's fear wearing a halo. The tide began to turn, not with revelation, but exhaustion. The jails were overflowing. The accused now included merchants, ministers, even soldiers, people too important to hang quietly. And then came the breaking point. Reverend George Burroughs, once Salem's own minister, accused of leading the witches. He climbed the gallows and before the crowd recited the Lord's Prayer, word for word, flawlessly. The air went still. Witches, it was said, could not pray. When he finished, even hardened men wept. Yet the rope still fell. But doubt, once planted, grows like ivy through stone. Soon after, a new accusation struck like lightning. Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor himself. The hysteria had reached the top. Governor William Phipps, already unnerved by the chaos, finally intervened. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, the engine of the witch hunt, and ordered all executions halted. The stage went dark. The silence that followed was not peace. It was disbelief. The aftermath was slower, quieter, crueler. Ministers who had once fanned the flames began to speak against them. Increase Mather, the colony's leading theologian, declared, "It is better that 10 witches escape than that one innocent suffer." A statement that would have been heresy only months before now sounded like wisdom. The crowd that once cheered the gallows now turned away, ashamed. The same hands that had thrown stones now folded in prayer for forgiveness. By the end of the year, the trials had collapsed under their own weight. A new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, replaced the old one in early 1693. This time the rules had changed. No more spectral evidence, no more screaming girls as witnesses, and suddenly the miracles of conviction ceased. Of 56 new cases, most were acquitted. Those who had confessed began to recant, admitting they'd lied out of fear or pain. Even the judges seemed smaller now, haunted men watching the tide of madness recede. Families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of their father's land. Rebecca Nurse's relatives fought to clear her name. The petitions piled up like unburied ghosts. Salem had traded fear for shame, and shame lingers longer. Governor Phipps, desperate to salvage the colony's reputation, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. The gallows were quiet, but quiet isn't the same as peace. Those who survived carried the weight of silence and the memory that their neighbors had watched. Churches split, friendships ended. The very air of Salem seemed changed, heavy with the echo of accusation. By spring, the hysteria was over. The damage, however, was permanent. A community that once prayed together had learned how easily prayer could turn into a weapon. The people of Salem awoke from their nightmare not redeemed, but hollow, staring at the ashes of their own faith. No devils had been driven out, only humanity exposed. Centuries later, the wind still moves through Gallows Hill, cold and ordinary. No rope, no bones, no fire, just grass and silence. But if you listen closely, you might still hear it. The faint creak of a wooden beam, the murmur of a crowd, and somewhere beneath it all, the sound of reason returning, too late, but finally awake. Part 7. The Weight of Memory. When the hanging stopped, the silence that followed was not peace. It was aftermath, the kind of silence that makes even prayer feel guilty. Salem's jail slowly emptied, but not without cost. Each prisoner was handed an invoice for survival, fees for chains, for straw, for the food that had barely kept them alive. Imagine losing your home, your family, and your health, only to pay for the privilege of having survived your own trial. By the end, 19 people had been executed, 1 crushed beneath stones, 5 dead in their cells, and more than 200 accused. The court hadn't just collapsed, it had devoured itself, leaving behind a crater of disbelief. The people of Salem looked around at the ruins of their faith and found no devils, only one another. The gallows were gone, the bodies buried, but the damage hung in the air. Neighbors could no longer meet each other's eyes. The same men who once shared pews had testified across the aisle. The same women who had prayed together now crossed the street in silence. Salem wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by memory. The young girls whose screams had set the fire in motion scattered. Some left the village altogether. Others disappeared into anonymity. One of them, Ann Putnam, Jr., would stand before her congregation in 1706, 14 years later, and confess, "I desire to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness." She blamed delusion, temptation, the devil himself, but the words came too late. You cannot apologize to the dead. Even the judges were not spared the weight of conscience. Judge Samuel Sewell, once one of the loudest voices in the courtroom, later stood during a church service as a minister, read his public confession aloud. He bowed his head and begged God's mercy. Few followed his example. Most preferred silence. The silence didn't last. Families of the executed began to demand that the colony acknowledge its sins. Petitions flooded the Massachusetts legislature, calls for pardons, for compensation, for something resembling justice. Years passed before the government even listened. In 1711, a bill restored the names and rights of some of the victims. Money was paid to a few surviving relatives, small amounts, symbolic gestures. But not everyone was included. The families of the Coreys and the Proctors were left off the list. Even in redemption, inequality lingered. Salem changed its name to Danvers decades later, as though a new name could wash away the stain. Gallows Hill remained unmarked. The people wanted to forget. But history has a cruel persistence. It lived on in sermons, in cautionary tales whispered to children, in the uneasy hush between former friends. The witch trials had not been born of witchcraft, but of fear, fear dressed in scripture, blessed by authority and obeyed by the terrified. The curse that lingered over Salem was not magic. It was the memory of what humans could do when fear was given power. More than 300 years later, the echo remains. The phrase witch hunt is thrown around carelessly now, a convenient metaphor for persecution. But for those who lived through it, it was not metaphor. It was rope and wood and law twisted into cruelty. The Salem witch trials stand as one of history's most sobering mirrors, proof that hysteria can masquerade as holiness, and that belief, when untested, becomes its own form of tyranny. In their aftermath, hard lessons were carved into law. When America eventually wrote its Constitution, the framers, consciously or not, wrote safeguards born from those ashes. No one would again be condemned on spectral evidence. The right to counsel, to face your accuser, to demand proof. These were not abstract ideals. They were the ghosts of Salem turned into clauses and rights. Every courtroom that demands evidence now carries a whisper of Gallows Hill. Never again. Fear had needed no demon. It had needed only permission. And when fear is sanctified, by courts, by pulpits, by governments, it grows unstoppable. Salem became the caution that power still fears to this day. But history, as it often does, turns the page from the Puritan villages of New England to the marble shadows of ancient Rome. If Salem showed how fear can twist faith, Rome would show how ambition could devour an empire. And in that world, centuries before Salem, another formidable figure would rise, and not from piety but from politics. Her name was Fulvia, and where Salem burned its women, Rome would try to bury hers in silence. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE, into the old but restless Fulvian line, a plebeian family that had clawed its way into Rome's upper ranks through cunning, luck, and a taste for upheaval. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his stammer than his speeches. His nickname literally meant the babbler, but his daughter would prove anything but tongue-tied. Fulvia's voice would one day echo through the Senate's marble halls and in the chants of street mobs. She grew up surrounded by politics and by danger. Rome, in her youth, was not a city of peace but of constant plotting. Generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were tearing the Republic apart, and alliances shifted faster than the Tiber's tide. For most Roman women, the safe choice was silence. Fulvia chose the opposite. Her education would have been elite, philosophy, rhetoric, law. But she learned her real lessons by watching power up close, in marriages arranged for politics, in friendships betrayed for votes, in the way the crowd could turn a rumor into revolution. Fulvia absorbed it all. When she spoke as if she'd been listening for years. Rome celebrated quiet wives. Fulvia became their nightmare, intelligent, ambitious, and unafraid to act. Her first marriage to Publius Clodius Pulcher set the tone for her life. Clodius was not a traditional Roman noble. He was chaos in a toga, a populist agitator who saw the Senate not as a sacred institution, but as a stage. To the elite, he was dangerous. To the people, he was magnetic. And to Fulvia, he was opportunity incarnate. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united two forces of disruption. Clodius understood how to wield spectacle. He had once infiltrated a women-only religious ceremony, disguised as one of the priestesses, scandalizing half of Rome. He renounced his patrician rank to become a tribune of the plebs, a representative of the commoners with the power to veto Senate decrees. He turned politics into theater, and Fulvia helped produce the show. She wasn't a bystander. Their home became a command center, a place where senators whispered strategy, where street leaders sought funding, where riots were planned over dinner. Fulvia managed the household with the precision of a general and the flair of an orator. She financed Clodius's campaigns, met with supporters, and earned both admiration and scorn for her visibility. Together they were a new kind of Roman power couple, equal parts scandal and momentum. But fame in Rome was a fragile shield. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the guards of his rival Titus Annius Milo. The news hit Rome like thunder. Yet Fulvia did not retreat into mourning. She weaponized it. She arranged a funeral that would shake the Republic. Clodius's mangled body was paraded through the forum, wounds bared to the public. The crowd gasped. Rage erupted. Riots swept through the streets, and in the chaos the Senate House burned. Fulvia had turned her husband's corpse into a political banner. Grief transformed into revolution. It was her first great act of power. And Rome would never forget her name. Fulvia's talent for bending emotion into strategy and grief into power made her one of the most unpredictable figures Rome had ever produced. When Clodius died, she did not vanish into widowhood. She stepped out of the smoke of his funeral and into the blaze of politics. Rome would never again think of her as someone's wife. She was now a political force in her own right. Mourning was not a luxury Fulvia could afford. In Rome, power was measured in speed. The quick consumed the slow. Not long after Clodius's bloody death, she aligned herself with another rising star. Gaius Scribonius Curio, an ambitious orator and one of Julius Caesar's most devoted allies. To outsiders, the match seemed strange. Curio was flamboyant, theatrical, even reckless, but behind the spectacle was a calculating mind that saw in Fulvia an equally daring partner. Curio, serving as tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, stood at the center of a republic ready to tear itself apart. Caesar and Pompey were circling each other like predators. The Senate trembled between them. Fulvia saw the moment with perfect clarity. This marriage was not about affection. It was a pact of survival. Clodius's supporters, restless and leaderless, could be molded into a new faction. Through Curio, Fulvia kept her hands on the pulse of Rome's streets, and her name whispered in every forum. Together they cultivated a movement. Fulvia re-energized the mobs that once shouted for her first husband, repackaging them as Curio's base. She managed their finances, their messages, even their rumors. Politics had become theater, and Fulvia understood the script better than anyone. But Rome was collapsing faster than either of them could adapt. When open war finally broke out between Caesar and Pompey, Curio threw himself into Caesar's cause. Fulvia backed him completely, organizing support, arranging supplies, and keeping his network alive while he campaigned. In 49 BCE, Curio sailed for North Africa to secure Caesar's flank. The expedition was catastrophic. Ambushed by Numidian forces under King Jugurtha, Curio's troops were massacred. He refused to retreat and died sword in hand. The man who had promised Fulvia a new political future never returned. For the second time she was a widow made by civil war. Rome watched her closely, expecting retreat or despair. Instead, Fulvia became sharper, harder, tempered like iron in chaos. 2 husbands dead, both martyrs for populist causes, and yet she refused to be erased. Her influence only deepened. Every tragedy she endured added another layer of authority. Then came the alliance that would make her legend. Around 47 BCE, Fulvia married Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's brash lieutenant and the most magnetic general of his age. Their union was not romance. It was consolidation. Antony brought armies, ambition, and raw charisma. Fulvia brought money, networks, and the cunning that could control a city from behind its marble columns. By this time she was a veteran of power's cruelty, fluent in the language of loyalty and betrayal. Antony, too, was no stranger to scandal. He was generous, reckless, often drunk, but he recognized Fulvia's worth. She could do what no legion could, keep Rome loyal while he was gone. Under Antony's trust, Fulvia did what no Roman woman before her had dared. She managed correspondence, issued orders in his name, sat in on councils, and advised on appointments. Ancient historians, nearly all men, painted her as grasping and arrogant, yet their outrage revealed the truth. She acted like a Roman statesman, not like the matron they expected. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the Republic again descended into blood and panic. Antony moved to secure Caesar's legacy, but in Rome Fulvia was the one holding the reins. As Antony and Octavian formed the Second Triumvirate, she ran his political machine at home, commanding the gangs, dispensing patronage, and keeping his allies united. She even brokered a symbolic reconciliation, marrying her daughter Claudia to Octavian in a brief truce of ambition. It would not last, but at the time it showed how central Fulvia had become. Her presence was everywhere, on coins, in decrees, whispered in the Senate corridors. Roman mint workers even stamped her name alongside Antony's portrait, an almost sacrilegious act in a world that never imagined a living woman on its currency. While Antony campaigned abroad, Fulvia effectively ruled the capital. She organized the treasury, negotiated with rival factions, and managed the ever-volatile urban masses. Rome after Caesar's death was a city governed by fear and bribery, and Fulvia played that game better than the men trained for it. Her name carried weight with soldiers, merchants, and politicians alike. But every coin she minted, every order she signed, built resentment among the aristocracy. Octavian's followers despised her influence. They whispered that Antony's wife meddled in affairs meant for men, that she commanded soldiers and dared to speak in assemblies. In truth, their outrage was less about impropriety than about power. Fulvia was not supposed to exist in their world, and yet she did, brilliantly. She could sense the tension tightening between Antony and Octavian. The triumvirate was cracking, and Fulvia knew the pattern of civil war better than anyone alive. She had lost husbands to it, survived it, profited from it. Now she would lead it. In 41 BCE, Fulvia crossed the final line. With Antony still in the east, she and Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother and a sitting consul, rose against Octavian. They declared their rebellion a defense of Antony's veterans and a stand against Octavian's land confiscations, which had displaced thousands of Italians. But beneath that justification burned Fulvia's will. This was her war. Contemporary writers struggled to describe it. A Roman woman leading armies, organizing strategy, dictating letters to generals. It defied every custom. She used Lucius as her figurehead in the Senate, while she coordinated the logistics and propaganda. 8 legions rallied to their cause. They seized the city of Perugia, modern Perugia, turning it into their stronghold. Fulvia became the heartbeat of the rebellion. She mobilized veterans furious over broken promises, spread messages that painted Octavian as a tyrant betraying Caesar's legacy, and kept Antony's name alive in every speech. The streets of Rome buzzed with rumor that Fulvia commanded troops herself, that she wore armor, that she forced Lucius into battles he wanted to avoid. The gossip was half truth, half awe, and entirely revealing of how far she had pushed Rome's boundaries. Octavian responded with ruthless precision. Through the harsh winter of 41 to 40 BCE, he besieged Perugia, cutting off food and communication. Inside the city, hunger turned soldiers into ghosts. Fulvia endured the cold and isolation as supplies dwindled. Letters between her and her allies begged Antony to return, but he was entangled in the east, and possibly in Cleopatra's company. By early spring, the rebellion collapsed. Perugia surrendered. Octavian, wary of provoking further chaos, spared Lucius Antonius, but exiled Fulvia. The Senate declared her too dangerous to remain in Italy, so ended the Perusine War, the first and last civil conflict in Roman history ignited by a woman. Fulvia sailed east to Greece, weary yet unbroken. She hoped to meet Antony, to explain that her war had been fought not against him but for him. Yet history rarely rewards devotion. News of Antony's affair with Cleopatra reached her before he did. Alone, ill, and branded an enemy of the state she once ruled from behind the scenes, Fulvia faded from the Roman stage she had dominated for more than a decade. But her legacy was impossible to erase. She had redefined what power could look like in a woman's hands: political, strategic, ruthless. In the eyes of her enemies, she was monstrous. In truth, she was merely ahead of her time. When the fires of rebellion finally dimmed, Fulvia stood alone among the ashes she herself had ignited. Her gamble had failed. The once powerful alliance between her and Mark Antony, built on passion, politics, and shared ambition, had withered under the strain of distance and betrayal. She had fought a war for his name, only to find herself exiled for it. Her act of defiance, the Perusine War, was the first civil conflict ever led by a Roman woman, and the last. Rome had demanded her punishment. Banished from the capital she once commanded, Fulvia crossed the sea and arrived in the Greek city of Sicyon, a resting place for the defeated and the forgotten. She came not as a conqueror, but as a ghost of her former self, a woman who had dared to challenge men who built empires from blood and rumor. To her, this exile was not shame, but sacrifice. She believed she had been defending Antony's honor, protecting the foundations of his power while he was away. But what waited for her in Sicyon was not triumph or gratitude. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything: her rank, her alliances, her safety, and for what? While she endured siege and starvation, Antony was in Egypt, dining in silk and candlelight beside Cleopatra. The irony was sharp enough to bleed. As Fulvia fought to preserve her husband's political future, he was building a new one without her. To some chroniclers, Antony's absence was mere coincidence. To others, it was betrayal dressed as strategy. Ancient historians like Plutarch would later claim that Antony raged against her for starting a war he never approved. Yet others whispered that he was relieved. Her downfall made him free to reconcile with Octavian, a peace Fulvia would have never allowed. In Greece, Fulvia's health faltered. The siege at Perusia had drained her body. The exile took her spirit. Her allies dwindled, her letters went unanswered. And even Antony's messengers came with politics, not affection. Within months, she was gone, dead at roughly 43, perhaps from illness, perhaps from grief. Her body was buried far from Rome, her name already slipping from official memory. And Antony? He moved swiftly to secure his position. He met with Octavian, sealed their alliance with marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia, and declared peace. The triumvirs were reunited. Fulvia was forgotten. But history rarely forgets women like her. It merely buries them under the weight of men's stories. Fulvia's erasure began almost immediately. The chroniclers of the age, all male and all eager to appease power, transformed her into a villain. They wrote that she was jealous, manipulative, and hungry for control. Dio Cassius mocked her temper. Appian accused her of inciting war for vanity. Plutarch painted her as a reckless wife who dragged Rome into chaos. Yet none of them could deny what she had done. Fulvia had raised armies, financed campaigns, commanded loyalty, and stood toe-to-toe with Rome's most dangerous men. She became Rome's favorite scapegoat, the woman blamed for every disaster she did not cause. When the Republic tore itself apart, they pointed to her. When Antony and Octavian quarreled, they said she was the root. When civil peace crumbled, her name carried the guilt. And yet, what she had done was no different from the men who ruled beside swords and lies. She was no crueler than Caesar, no more ambitious than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would later become. Her only sin was existing as a woman, in the arena of men, and winning long enough to make them nervous. After her death, Even Antony joined the chorus of revisionists. He blamed Fulvia for the chaos she had fought to contain, using her memory as a political apology. To Rome, she became a convenient ghost, erased from monuments, absent from honors, omitted from speeches. No grand funeral marked her passing, no statues preserved her likeness. Rome wanted her gone, not grieved, but she refused to vanish. Her legacy lingered in the cracks of history, in the whispers of soldiers who once fought under her name, and in the ink of ancient coinage that bore her image. Fulvia had carved her initials into the marble of Roman memory. She had been the first Roman woman to appear on currency not as a goddess, but as herself, a mortal wielding power through sheer force of will. That small, circular piece of silver was both rebellion and confession. It said, I existed, I mattered, I ruled. The narrative of her villainy persisted for centuries. Men wrote it. Men repeated it. But beneath their distortions, another story glows. The story of a woman who refused the confines of obedience and chose instead the peril of authority. Fulvia didn't whisper influence from behind a curtain. She thundered it from the forum steps. In an age that defined women by silence, she turned her voice into an instrument of revolution. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a Caesar, a reformer, or a conqueror. Instead, she became a warning. What happens when a woman dares to hold a man's sword? Still, even her enemies could not erase the mark she left on Rome. In her wake came women who learned from her defiance: Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and of course, Cleopatra. Each in her own way would inherit Fulvia's shadow, wielding charm and cunning to steer the empire's destiny. But Fulvia had done it first. Without the armor of royalty or the protection of dynasty, she fought with audacity alone. Modern historians have begun to restore her story. No longer the shrill caricature drawn by ancient pens, she stands now as one of Rome's first true political architects, a woman who maneuvered through civil war and used every tool available. From marriage alliances to military command, she blurred the line between wife and statesman, between rebellion and duty. Fulvia's Rome was a brutal place, but she matched it blow for blow. Her tragedy wasn't her ambition. It was that she lived in a world unready for her kind of courage. Her death didn't end her influence. It began her legend. Centuries later, when the ruins of Rome became symbols rather than battlegrounds, her name still appeared in the margins of scholarly texts, half condemned, half praised. The men who had tried to erase her inadvertently preserved her, their hatred a reluctant monument. In the end, Fulvia achieved what few Romans ever did. She outlasted the gossip. Rome never built a statue for her, but she built one for herself in history, echoes of power. From Rome to America, history, like empire, moves in circles. 2,000 years after Fulvia's death, another kind of rebellion took shape on different soil, this time not in marble halls, but on the streets of a divided America. By the summer of 1963, the United States was teetering between two futures, one bound to the chains of its past and one struggling toward freedom. In the Deep South, segregation was still law. Black Americans were barred from schools, restaurants, buses, even public water fountains. Police violence was routine. Lynchings still scarred the land. In places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful demonstrators were met with batons, fire hoses, and the snarling teeth of police dogs. But oppression breeds resistance, and resistance was awake. The civil rights movement had gathered momentum like a rising tide. Sit-ins, boycotts, and freedom rides filled the headlines. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis had become not just people but principles. Across the country, the call for justice grew too loud to ignore. The idea of marching on Washington had been whispered for decades. In the 1940s, A. Philip Randolph, a visionary labor leader, had proposed such a protest to demand equality in defense industries. That march never happened, halted only when President Roosevelt issued an executive order to appease it. But 2 decades later, the dream was reborn. The stakes were no longer economic, they were existential. This was not just about jobs. It was about dignity, survival, and the right to exist as equals under the same flag. By 1963, Randolph joined forces with Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Together, they transformed a whisper into a movement. Despite deep divisions among civil rights groups, they united under a single purpose: to confront America with its own conscience. The plan was audacious, a mass demonstration in the heart of the nation's capital. Thousands would march to demand voting rights, fair wages, school desegregation, and justice long denied. Organizing it was a miracle of discipline and faith. Buses were chartered from across the country. Churches opened their doors to volunteers. Flyers, handwritten and mimeographed, spread like wildfire through communities hungry for change. By dawn on August 28, 1963, Washington, D.C. awoke to the sound of footsteps, hundreds of thousands of them. Men and women, young and old, black and white, walking together toward the Lincoln Memorial. It was the largest peaceful protest in American history. The air trembled with purpose, and there on those marble steps Dr. King delivered a sermon that transcended politics and entered the realm of prophecy. His "I Have a Dream" speech turned the mall into sacred ground. Like Fulvia standing before the Roman Forum centuries earlier, King spoke not only to his time, but to every generation that would follow. Both knew the same truth, that power unchecked must be challenged, and that silence in the face of injustice is itself a crime. Fulvia, Rome's unforgiven flame. When the noise of rebellion finally faded, Fulvia stood amid the ruins of her own defiance. The gamble she had made, staking her life, her reputation, and her marriage on the outcome of a war, had failed. The once mighty bond between her and Mark Antony, forged through passion and power, had dissolved under distance, deceit, and exhaustion. She had waged battle in his name, and now she was condemned for it. Her war, the Perusine Revolt, would be remembered as the first civil conflict ever commanded by a Roman woman, and the last. Driven from the capital she had once ruled through charisma and fear, Fulvia crossed the Mediterranean to Greece. The ship carried not a conqueror, but a woman stripped of everything but pride. The city of Sixion, a sanctuary for Rome's exiles, received her like a graveyard receives its ghosts. Yet Fulvia did not see herself as defeated. To her, exile was another campaign, a sacrifice made to defend Antony's honor while he wandered in the east. She told herself she had fought to preserve his name, his soldiers, and their shared dream of Rome's future. But when she arrived, no fanfare met her, only silence. She had risked everything and found nothing waiting. While she endured hunger and siege, Antony feasted beside Cleopatra in Egypt, silk, gold, and betrayal replacing loyalty. Ancient gossip said her husband's heart had drifted, that the general's affections now belonged to the Nile's queen. For Fulvia, the insult was unbearable. While she fought in his stead, he toasted another woman's beauty. Historians would argue over the details. Some claimed Antony raged at her rebellion. Furious, she had drawn blood in his name without consent. Others said he welcomed her fall. It cleared the way for a marriage to Octavian's sister, a union that would cement his fragile alliance with Rome's rising ruler. Whatever the truth, one fact endured: Fulvia was alone. Her health faltered in Greece. The siege of Perusia had wasted her body, and the cold indifference of exile gnawed at her will. The friends who once crowded her halls now vanished into safer loyalties. Letters she sent went unanswered. Messengers brought politics, not love. And so, in the foreign stillness of Sixion, Fulvia's story ended. She was 43, perhaps dead of fever, perhaps of heartbreak, perhaps of both. Antony, freed by her absence, acted swiftly. Within weeks he reconciled with Octavian, sealed peace through a new marriage to Octavia, and restored the triumvirate. Rome applauded. Fulvia's name was erased, her ashes left to cool in foreign soil. But history does not forget its rebels. It only buries them under the weight of men's retellings. Fulvia's erasure began before her body cooled. Roman chroniclers, senators, soldiers, and scholars alike, redrafted her life to fit their comfort. Dio Cassius mocked her temper. Appian called her vain. Plutarch described her as a jealous shrew who dragged men into ruin. Their words echoed through centuries, forming a convenient myth, the dangerous woman who reached too far. Yet beneath their ink lay fear. They could not deny what she had done. Fulvia had raised armies. She had financed campaigns. She had commanded loyalty from legions of men in a republic that denied her the right to vote. In every measure that counted in Rome, wealth, will, influence, she had matched the men who now condemned her, and for that she became the scapegoat of a collapsing world. When the republic tore itself apart, they blamed her. When Antony quarreled with Octavian, they named her as the cause. When peace failed, her ghost bore the guilt. But Fulvia's ambition was no greater than Caesar's, no harsher than Pompey's, and far less cruel than Octavian's would one day be. Her only real crime was audacity, a woman daring to act as though she belonged among Rome's generals. Even Antony, whose power she had protected at every turn, joined the chorus of betrayal. He called her reckless, a political liability, a symbol of excess. Her death became his absolution. No monuments rose in her honor. No orators mourned her. Rome sealed her memory in silence, the cruelest of tombs, and yet she endured. Her image appeared on coins, small circles of defiance that survived long after statues crumbled. There she was, not as a goddess or a metaphor, but as herself, Fulvia, mortal and powerful. Each coin was a whisper from history's underside. I lived. I fought. I ruled. The men who wrote her downfall ensured her immortality. They thought to make her a warning. They made her a legend. Behind their accusations of jealousy and pride lies the truth of a woman who refused to disappear quietly. Fulvia's voice did not tremble behind curtains. It thundered through the streets of Rome. When others sought to influence from shadows, she commanded from the light. Had she been born male, Rome might have worshipped her. She would have been hailed as strategist, statesman, or conqueror. Instead, she became a lesson in fear, what happens when a woman refuses obedience. Still, even her enemies could not fully erase her imprint. Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, Cleopatra, they all walked in her echo, learning how power bends when wielded by hands the empire tried to bind. Fulvia had been the first to grasp that truth. Power respects only those bold enough to seize it. Modern scholars have begun to unearth her from beneath centuries of slander. The caricature fades, replaced by the portrait of a strategist, a woman who navigated Rome's civil wars with intellect sharper than any blade. She blurred the boundaries between wife and warrior, between rebellion and governance. Hers was a mind suited not for the loom but for the Senate, and though history condemned her for it, time has begun to admire her courage. Her death did not extinguish her. It illuminated the void she left behind. Generations later, when Rome's empire had fallen and only its myths remained, Fulvia's name still flickered in the manuscripts of historians who could not decide whether to despise or admire her. Their contempt preserved her better than praise ever could. Rome never carved her likeness in marble, but she carved herself into Rome's memory. The echo of defiance. From Rome to Washington, history repeats its rebellions in new languages. Nearly 2 millennia after Fulvia's fall, another struggle for justice rose, not in a marble forum, but on the streets of America. By the summer of 1963, the United States trembled on the edge of transformation. One nation clung to its past, another reached for its future. In the Deep South, segregation was written into law and enforced with batons. Black citizens were barred from schools, restaurants, buses, and even the right to vote. Police violence was not scandal. It was routine. In Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful demonstrators were met with snarling dogs and jets of water strong enough to tear skin. Yet, as always, oppression summoned resistance. The civil rights movement had grown into a tidal wave. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts swept across the nation. Names like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis had become the vocabulary of courage. What had begun as a whisper in churches and union halls now roared from every street corner. Enough. The dream of marching on Washington had been born long before 1963. In the 1940s, the labor organizer A. Philip Randolph had imagined a great protest to force equality in defense industries. That vision had been postponed when President Roosevelt, fearing unrest, issued an executive order promising reform. But 2 decades later, the promise was unfulfilled. Now Randolph, joined by Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the plan with renewed purpose. This was no longer a march for jobs, it was a march for existence itself. Its goals were simple and absolute: voting rights, equal pay, desegregation, and dignity. Across the country, buses were chartered, lunches packed, and hope rehearsed in hymns. Churches became planning centers. Barbershops became offices. Communities pooled coins to send delegates to Washington. The movement's strength lay not in its leaders, but in the thousands who refused to remain silent another day. At dawn on August 28, 1963, the city awoke to the rhythm of footsteps, hundreds of thousands converging on the National Mall. They came in pressed shirts and Sunday hats, carrying signs that spoke the language of justice. Old men walked beside children. Priests marched beside poets. The air shimmered with heat and faith. And there, before the statue of Lincoln, the man who had signed freedom's first unfinished draft, Dr. King took the podium. His words did not belong to politics. They belonged to prophecy. "I Have a Dream" was more than a speech. It was a mirror held up to America's soul. He spoke of promises unkept, of mountains still to climb, and of a day when equality would cease to be an aspiration and become law. Centuries apart, Fulvia and King shared the same defiance, the conviction that silence in the face of injustice is itself a sin. One had fought with armies, the other with words, but both understood that power only yields when confronted by those brave enough to demand it. History moves in circles. From Rome's marble forums to Washington's marble steps, the struggle remains the same: to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. Fulvia's fire burned in the shadows of empire. King's dream carried that flame into the modern world, the march that moved a nation buttons reading freedom. Now glimmered in the sunlight, pinned to shirts that were damp with August heat. Around 250,000 voices breathed in rhythm, united by hope. The faces in that immense crowd weren't spectators. They were participants in history, sculpting it moment by moment. Each one would remember the sound of their own heartbeat merging with 249,999 others. From a distance, the march on Washington appeared flawless, peaceful, inspired, almost divine. But behind the grace and symbolism lay chaos, compromise and constant calculation. What the world saw as seamless unity was, in truth, a miracle stitched together with exhaustion, courage, and 1,000 disagreements barely contained. Bayard Rustin, the logistical genius behind it all, spent months navigating storms of politics and prejudice. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was the scrutiny. Rustin was openly gay and a former socialist organizer, facts his opponents never let him forget. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't drop him from an earlier campaign. That rumor lingered over every planning meeting, every press call, every late-night strategy session. Rustin pressed on. He handled transportation routes, crowd control, sound systems, sanitation, and even food vendors. While others gave speeches, he kept the trains running on time, literally. Yet his name would barely appear in the next morning's newspapers. The march also revealed the blind spots of its own revolution. Women, who had built the movement, led sit-ins, and risked their lives, were largely excluded from the microphone. Figures like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height organized tirelessly behind the scenes, but none were invited to deliver a keynote. Even Rosa Parks, the symbol of resistance, sat quietly among the crowd. History would call her the mother of the movement, but that day she wasn't given a voice. Inside the Big Six civil rights organizations, tensions simmered. Younger activists from SNCC grew frustrated with the deliberate pace of older leaders. They wanted confrontation, not ceremony. Core organizers echoed that sentiment, demanding direct action instead of patient diplomacy. But for one day, unity mattered more than purity. The movement held its breath and marched as one. Meanwhile, the federal government prepared for disaster. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI deployed more than 100 agents to spy, photograph, and record. Hotel phones were tapped, letters intercepted. Informants lurked among volunteers. Hoover was certain the event would end in violence or worse, communist infiltration. When the day passed peacefully, he didn't relax. He simply expanded surveillance, focusing his paranoia squarely on Dr. King. Then there was money, or rather the lack of it. The march cost over $250,000, equal to several million today. Organizers scraped funds from unions, churches, and private donors. They borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts and begged bus companies for discounts. The fact that the march happened at all was a logistical resurrection. As the afternoon waned, the heat softened to gold. The crowd sang, wept, and clung to one another as the sun slid behind the Washington Monument. For many, leaving felt impossible, as if the ground beneath their feet had become sacred. They lingered in disbelief that something so vast could end so quietly. The world had witnessed the dream, but now came the harder question: what next? In the days that followed, major newspapers responded with cautious admiration. Editorials called the demonstration orderly and dignified, coded language for no one rioted. Few journalists mentioned the march's economic agenda, the call for a federal jobs program, fair wages, and school desegregation. Yet every outlet carried one headline: the speech. Dr. King's words were impossible to ignore. His "I have a dream" refrain echoed from living rooms to lunch counters, a sermon stitched into the nation's conscience. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the march, watched it live on television. By the time King finished, Kennedy was visibly moved. He met with civil rights leaders that evening at the White House, calling the demonstration impressive. But admiration didn't equal action. His proposed Civil Rights Act still languished in Congress, tangled in Southern resistance. Many activists were quietly disappointed. They had prayed for a breakthrough, not a pat on the back. Within weeks, the grim reminder of how far they still had to go came crashing down. On September 15, 1963, a bomb ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 young black girls. Their names, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, became a requiem for innocence. The dream had been spoken, but the nightmare still ruled. Yet something fundamental had changed. The March on Washington had proven that mass protest could be powerful, disciplined, and unstoppable. It united labor leaders, clergy, celebrities, students, and everyday workers under one banner. It gave the movement a visible face, a rhythm, and a rallying cry. From that day forward, the demand for justice could no longer be ignored or delayed with polite excuses. Legislatively, progress remained slow, but momentum had shifted. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, banning segregation and discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The following year, the Voting Rights Act struck down the barriers that had silenced black voters for generations. Would these laws have passed without the march? Perhaps. But without that ocean of humanity before the Lincoln Memorial, would they have carried the same moral thunder? Almost certainly not. For Dr. King, August 28th transformed him from respected preacher to global icon. But fame came with surveillance, threats, and ultimately martyrdom. The movement gained a symbol and lost its prophet 5 years later. The march became a template for change. It showed that disciplined unity could move mountains. It inspired liberation movements worldwide, from anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa to student activists across Europe. Wherever injustice reigned, the memory of Washington served as proof that courage multiplied by numbers could rewrite history, and the resonance hasn't faded. The slogans, songs, and imagery of that day echo through every generation that followed. When the Million Man March filled the same space in 1995, when crowds shouted Black Lives Matter in 2020, the same spirit stirred. The cardboard signs were new, but the cry was the same. Freedom now today. King's statue gazes across the tidal basin toward the marble steps where he once stood. His words are etched into stone, but the true memorial isn't granite. It's living breath. It's in classrooms where children recite his speech, in polling stations where votes are cast, in every peaceful protest where people refuse to be silent. More than 60 years later, the question still lingers in the national air. Has the dream been realized or only deferred? In many ways, progress is undeniable. Segregation's legal skeleton has been dismantled. Black Americans now serve as judges, mayors, senators, and presidents, roles that were unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage is protected by law. Representation, once unimaginable, has become everyday reality. These are triumphs, earned not through luck but through relentless struggle. And yet the demands written on the placards of that summer afternoon have not all been met. The promise of economic justice, a living wage, equal housing, and equitable education remains elusive. Police brutality, the very injustice that ignited early protests, still sparks grief and rage. The same calls for dignity echo through new megaphones. Movements like Black Lives Matter march through the same cities, chant down the same avenues, and demand the same humanity. Their tools are different, hashtags and live streams instead of leaflets and telegrams, but the fight is unchanged. The 1963 march was never meant as closure. It was a declaration. It planted a stake in the ground and said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." Every protest since has been an echo of that first collective heartbeat. When future generations walk past King's Memorial, they see more than stone. They see endurance, the proof that one day's courage can ripple across centuries. The dream wasn't written to rest in textbooks. It was written to be lived, challenged, and renewed. And as long as people still gather under banners of freedom, as long as voices still rise against injustice, that August afternoon will never truly end, so the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality, because the dream was never meant to be enshrined in memory. It was meant to be practiced, in streets and classrooms, in ballots and laws, in every act of ordinary defiance that insists freedom is not finished work. Each generation inherits the same unfinished promise, to prove that equality is not a gift granted, but a birthright reclaimed. The March on Washington was not an ending. It was a beginning disguised as a conclusion, a reminder that democracy must be remade each time people rise to demand it. 60 years later, the echoes of that day still move through the veins of the nation, asking the same question in a new century: who will march next?